Okay, now we've finally come to the other references part of our presentation. We've looked through the 457 BC, we've talked about 2,300 years, and we've talked about Yom Kippur as it associates with Daniel 8. And on every one of these points, I believe that the Bible is not consistent with the teaching of 1844 being a beginning of an investigative judgment or the work of Yom Kippur in heaven. However, next I want to take a look at a few more points. So Josephus, a Jewish historian, we're going to look at some of his work, and we're going to take a look at Jesus' own words and what he have to say on this particular topic, and take a little bit of a gander at the historic interpretation of Daniel and critics of the book of Daniel, what they have to say about Daniel and their reason that they choose to not believe Daniel, or at least one of the reasons. There's a few, depending on which group they're in, but one of the reasons that they choose to challenge Daniel as a prophetic book. So we'll take a look at a couple of those. Here's what we're going to talk about. So in Jesus' day, we're going to talk about Josephus, Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian, and some of his writings. I'm only going to talk about the Antiquities of the Jews and bring up that passage, but he has quite a bit of information in the Wars of the Jews also about this section. We're going to talk about Jesus' words in Matthew 24 and some other historical interpretation views of Daniel and the implications of some of what they're saying. All right, so that's that. Let's take a look first at Josephus. This is from Josephus, the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 10. This is in the second volume. So Book 10, Chapter 11, if you're wanting to read along, I've got it here on the screen. The very last passage in Chapter 11 actually has the part that I'm going to read. Now, this is a fairly healthy section, and you guys have heard me read. So if I read this, we'll never get through it. Instead, I'm going to borrow my friends from LibriVox, and I'll leave a link on how to reach LibriVox. That's an online audiobook site. And if you're going to want to read Josephus, you probably want to listen to Josephus. So go download the Josephus collection from there, and you can listen to all of these. But here I've kind of clipped this event so that it tells the very beginning, and then it's going to start here in section 7, and we'll read all the way to the end, and then that'll be the end of the passage.
Book 10, Chapter 11 of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2, by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston. Book 10, Chapter 11. When, therefore, those that had intended to thus destroy Daniel by treachery were themselves destroyed, King Darius sent letters all over the country, and praised that God whom Daniel worshipped, and said that he was the only true God, and had all power. He had also Daniel in very great esteem, and made him the principal of his friends. Now when Daniel was become so illustrious and famous, on account of the opinion men had that he was beloved of God, he built a tower at Ecbatana in Media. It was a most elegant building and wonderfully made, and it is still remaining, and preserved to this day. And to such as see it, it appears to have been but lately built, and to have been no older than that very day when any one looks upon it. It is so fresh, flourishing, and beautiful, and in no way grown old in so long a time. For buildings suffer the same as men do. They grow old as well as they, and by numbers of years their strength is dissolved, and their beauty withered. Now they bury the kings of Media, of Persia, and Parthia in this tower to this day, and he who was entrusted with the care of it was a Jewish priest, which thing is also observed to this day. But it is fit to give an account of what this man did, which is most admirable to hear, for he was so happy as to have strange revelations made to him, and those as to one of the greatest of the prophets, insomuch that while he was alive he had the esteem and applause both of the kings and of the multitude. And now he is dead, he retains a remembrance that will never fail, for the several books that he wrote and left behind him are still read by us till this time, and from them we believe that Daniel conversed with God, for he did not only prophesy of future events, as did the other prophets, but he also determined the time of their accomplishment. And while prophets used to foretell misfortunes, and on that account were disagreeable both to the kings and to the multitude, Daniel was to them a prophet of good things, and this to such a degree, that by the agreeable nature of his predictions he procured the goodwill of all men, and by the accomplishment of them he procured the belief of their truth, and the opinion of a sort of divinity for himself among the multitude. He also wrote and left behind him what made manifest the accuracy and undeniable veracity of his predictions, for he saith that when he was in Susa, the metropolis of Persia, and went out into the field with his companions, there was on the sudden a motion and concussion of the earth, and that he was left alone by himself, his friends fleeing away from him, and that he was disturbed, and fell on his face, and on his 2 hands, and that a certain person touched him, and at the same time bid him rise, to see what would befall his countrymen after many generations. He also related that when he stood up he was shown a great ram, with many horns growing out of his head, and that the last was higher than the rest; that after this he looked to the west, and saw a he-goat carried through the air from that quarter; that he rushed upon the ram with violence, and smote him twice with his horns, and overthrew him to the ground, and trampled upon him; that afterward he saw a very great horn growing out of the head of the he-goat, and that when it was broken off, 4 horns grew up that were exposed to each of the 4 winds; and he wrote that out of them arose another lesser horn, which, as he said, waxed great, and that God showed to him that it should fight against his nation, and take their city by force, and bring the temple worship to confusion, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 1,296 days. Daniel wrote that he saw these visions in the plain of Susa, and he hath informed us that God interpreted the appearance of this vision after the following manner. He said that the ram signified the kingdoms of the Medes and Persians, and the horns those kings that were to reign in them, and that the last horn signified the last king, and that he should exceed all the kings in riches and glory; that the he-goat signified that one should come and reign from the Greeks, who should twice fight with the Persian, and overcome him in battle, and should receive his entire dominion; that by the great horn which sprang out of the forehead of the he-goat was meant the first king; and that the springing up of 4 horns upon its falling off, and the conversion of every one of them to the 4 quarters of the earth, signified the successors that should arise after the death of the first king, and the partition of his kingdom among them; and that they should be neither his children nor of his kindred; and that they should reign over the habitable earth for many years; and that from them there should arise a certain king that should overcome our nation and their laws, and should take away their political government, and should spoil the temple, and forbid the sacrifices to be offered for 3 years' time. And indeed it so came to pass, that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes, according to Daniel's vision, and what he wrote many years before they came to pass. In the very same manner Daniel also wrote concerning the Roman government, and that our country should be made desolate by them. All these things did this man leave in writing, as God had showed them to him, insomuch that such as read his prophecies, and see how they have been fulfilled, would wonder at the honor wherewith God honored Daniel, and may thence discover how the Epicureans are in an error, who cast providence out of human life, and do not believe that God takes care of the affairs of the world, nor that the universe is governed and continued in being by that blessed and immortal nature, but say that the world is carried along of its own accord, without a ruler and a curator, which, were it destitute of a guide to conduct it as they imagine, it would be like ships without pilots, which we see drowned by the winds, or like chariots without drivers, which are overturned; so would the world be dashed to pieces by its being carried without a providence, and so perish, and come to naught. So that, by the forementioned practices of Daniel, those men seem to me very much to err from the truth, who determine that God exercises no providence over human affairs; for if that were the case, that the world went on by mechanical necessity, we should not see that all things would come to pass according to his prophecy. Now as to myself, I have so described these matters as I have found them and read them, but if any one is inclined to another opinion about them, let him enjoy his different sentiments without any blame from me. End of Book 10, Chapter 11. End of the Antiquities of the Jews, Volume 2, by Flavius Josephus. Translated by William Whiston.
Okay, so we've looked at a lot of material in this series, and I want to wrap up real quick. So let's flip over to my slides. Here's the list of things we started with. We talked about 1844 and how it relates to 457 BC, and specifically was interested in how the Daniel 9 relates to Daniel 8. We talked about that some. We talked about the day for a year extensively in a couple different ways. We went through the proof text. Here are all the examples that we went through. We even talked a little bit about the 1,000 years, and still interested on any explanation as to why 42 months, how we get a day for a year out of that, how we assume 30 days for a month, because there's no known, I am not aware of any month system that has exactly or has ever had exactly 30 days. The Jewish did not. It's based on a lunar calendar. So I'm interested in how that, how we arrived at that particular system between the Jewish and the modern, and anybody that would have been involved in this along the way. We talked about extensively about Daniel 9 and the weeks, and here's a lot of the stuff that we went into related to that, specifically the likely translation that was supposed to mean is sevens, and referring to the sabbatical years as opposed to weeks. So we went into quite a bit of detail on the sanctuary in Hebrews 9. I think the clear reading of that, if you read the passage the way it's written, and in any version you want, I think it's pretty clear that the message of that passage is that Jesus' work began immediately. It's all past tense. That was part of his work. It was not something that was delayed nearly 2 millennia. So I think that passage alone should be sufficient. We talked about Kippur, the word for atonement, has nothing to do with being made right, which is what the word means in Daniel 8. They're not the same, one being atonement, the other meaning set right or justified. Those two they may sound like they have relation, but they're not the same thing. And the context around each of those is not the same. So then we went into some additional references, and you heard Josephus' work on what he has to say around Daniel, and how he believes that was an interpretation. And this is in Jesus' day that Josephus would have written that. So the important aspect then to come away with here is that in Jesus' own words, when he says to the people there that he gives a warning about the abomination which will cause desolation, let the reader understand when he's talking about Daniel, that makes complete sense if Jesus' words are to be interpreted as applicable to a fulfillment in Daniel where the abomination of desolation had something to do with Daniel. If it is intended to apply to something that won't occur for hundreds of years and is completely unrelated to the destruction of the temple, then it makes no sense whatsoever. It just doesn't make sense. It's not consistent. It doesn't apply. So I'm interested in contending theories, especially if we have references and there's something to go by otherwise. I've looked at this quite a bit, but it's entirely possible I've missed something. So by all means, if you feel that I am in error, drop me a note. Let me know. Let me know what you think this list of stuff is wrong. One thing I want to end with, just so you know, I don't know if I've mentioned this, but There's a group of people that look at Daniel, unlike Josephus, where Josephus clearly was looking at him as a prophet. But there's a group of people that believe that Daniel was actually a retrospective, and he was writing about history as opposed to being writing as a prophet. And that perspective comes from a couple things. One is they dig around with the words, and there are some difficult words there. They look at Daniel because it's combining different texts from Aramaic and Hebrew, whether or not they were all originally Hebrew and Aramaic, or whether someone was translated one way or the other. It's hard to tell. But a lot of people believe that's why it's in the Ketuvim of the Hebrew scriptures as opposed to the Nevi'im, the writings versus the prophets. But regardless, one thing that you should come away with in that discussion, that one of the reasons that they believe that this was a historical account is because of how directly it was fulfilled in the things that happened to Israel during the days of Antiochus. Now, that statement alone should say to us that there's something here. Even the critics, the people that do not agree with Daniel being a prophet, look at this and see a fulfillment. To the extent of, some of the comments that I've read on this are there's just no way this could be a fulfillment because it lists every single battle. Yeah, it did. It was very detailed, Daniel 10, 11, and 12, and how a lot of that battle occurred. So the idea that this is something that was projected way into the future as opposed to being a retrospective, they can't handle that because the idea of projecting into the future and ignoring the fact that virtually everybody, even the critics, agree on the completeness of how this was fulfilled already doesn't make sense to me. Incidentally, what many people don't know is that a King James Bible up until around 1880s had several extra books in them. One set of books was the Book of the Maccabees. The Book of the Maccabees recorded these events. Now, they were removed not because they were inaccurate. It's just people to believe that they were not. They were not originally Hebrew books. They were originally written in Greek, I believe, and they have valid history in them. So I don't know of anybody that challenges them on the historic value. I think they just believe that they weren't holy or inspired books. Regardless, those books that record the history of Yehuda Maccabee and the wars of Maccabees, those are critical books that if we had looked at those at the same time as looking at Daniel and looking at Josephus and other people of the time, almost certainly would have come away with a different view of this book. Instead of trying to look for something that specifically called out when Jesus was going to return, if we had looked at these books and understood how they were being interpreted and what the meaning for these books were, perhaps we wouldn't even be having this conversation, and maybe that's good or not. I don't know. Here's what I think you should come away with. I think that we do not do ourselves a justice when we ignore obvious fact and obvious truth. I believe that what I presented in this is true. I believe that there's going to be a lot of bias in everybody that watches it. I hope not. But I expect that because of the type of topic that I'm talking about, that it automatically is going to, people's dander is going to get up about it. I can't help that. But as I said, I believe at the beginning, when we are interpreting the Bible, we should understand that unlike the math and the sciences, where you can very easily prove your point with the math and sciences, I can put a couple blocks up on a table, and I can add a couple more blocks and prove definitively that with empirical evidence that 2 blocks and then 2 more blocks is now 4 blocks without dispute. But in theology, in the study of God and the Bible, it is not as clear and clean cut. There is not always, in trying to understand the mysteries of the Bible, it's not always as clear that what you have searched out is in fact the final answer. And this is why there's a lot of debate on a lot of these topics. And it is arrogant to look at these, and it's unhealthy to look at these and say that there is a definitive answer, I have it, you don't, and if you disagree with me, you are clearly wrong. I think Josephus said it best. If you have a different view, I don't hold that against you. That's fine. That's okay. I think that how we view this particular topic or any other is not a topic of salvation. There are very few topics of salvation. This isn't one of them. Those topics of salvation and what I believe and what I think is true, God does not depend on me to have an understanding of him in order to save me. It is his work in me and not my work that recommends me to him. And I think that's an important aspect as well. So, at the risk of going off into a long tangent and rambling, thank you for watching. I hope that this has been meaningful and a blessing for you. And whether you observed it for education, or whether you agreed or disagree, either way, I appreciate that you at least took the time to look at it and see what I have to say. And I would appreciate it if you let me know if you disagree. If you agree, thanks. Feel free to like it. I'll probably put out other videos as well. If you want to subscribe, it's fine. But if you disagree and you think that I'm off base on this, sure, tell me. I don't want to produce false statements. It doesn't mean I necessarily am going to agree with you. I've spent a lot of time looking at this, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to be right either. And as iron sharpens iron, so when one sharpens another, by all means, sharpen me. Thanks again. I appreciate all of you. God bless, and have a great week. Take care.